minister who pastored 2 California congregations before working in Bangladesh as a freelance communications consultant for 7 years. She wrote, produced, and directed award-winning videos for poverty alleviation projects. Debbie has preached at or served as temporary pastor for numerous UCC congregations and has served as the chair of the board of Vermont Conference of the UCC. She has also served as an elected public servant in Vermont. Debbie has served 6 years on the Williston Select Board and 4 years as a state senator representing Chittenden County. The Reverend Debbie Ingram has served as executive director of Vermont Interfaith Action for the past 14 years, convincingly embracing the vital importance of the work in the Vermont Interfaith Action. Debbie balances research, knowledge, and humor. She exhibits a willingness to claim the mission of VIA as a manner that is sure to continue to capture the attention of the imagination of many Vermonters. When Debbie spoke at VIA's recent annual meeting, she called the VIA the moral conscience of the state of Vermont. Debbie, we are so glad to welcome you this morning. Thank you for being with us and leading the workshop in the important topic of racial justice, housing, and land ownership in Vermont. Thank you and welcome.
What a nice introduction. I appreciate that. And thank you all of you for being here today. So this presentation came out of the work that some local organizing groups are doing at Vermont Interfaith Action. And we have some folks here who are active in those groups. So thanks for being here as well. We have one that particularly focuses on economic opportunities with regard to housing and land ownership for people of color. So that's where this particular presentation came from. So, oh, it went away. Is it Max is up there? Great, thank you. Yes, so what the presentation will cover, we're going to talk a little bit about the historical background of discrimination, racial discrimination, in most especially in housing throughout our country, our country's history. And then we'll talk a little bit about Vermont data so that you see that, what has gone on specifically in the state. And then I don't want to leave you feeling depressed or like, there's nothing that you can do about what you hear. We want to give you some next steps for action to take to try to improve the situation. So next slide, please. Okay, so first of all, we'll just dive right in and talk about wealth. What does wealth mean? And I'm just using the kind of standard definition, which is it's a person's net worth. And net worth is defined as your assets minus your debts. So your house, your savings, your investments, your pension plan, your your other things that you might own, your assets minus the debts that you have, student loan debts or credit card debts or any of that kind of thing. So why does wealth matter? Well, it matters in your current financial situation so that you can meet challenges. If you have some kind of terrible health catastrophe, if you lose your job, or if there's an economic crisis, as there have been in the country, it helps if you have wealth, then you can weather those storms. And then it also helps a family who has wealth to invest in the future. So you can pay for your children's college tuition, and they are not saddled with student debt. You can use wealth to start a business or to buy additional assets. So it's a good thing to have. Wealth is important. So next, please. Okay, so just looking at the numbers, When we talk about net worth, there are two ways you can look at it. You can talk about it in terms of the mean or in terms of the median. So the mean net worth by race in the United States, the mean, of course, is the average. So the mean is often skewed, though, because the very, very wealthiest people at the top make it seem like everybody has more money. So the mean is, for white people, is close to $1 million. And for black people, it's a little bit less than 200,000. So there's a huge gap there. Hispanic families have a little bit more than black families, and then other races like Asian Pacific Islander have more, but nobody has as much as white families. Then on the next slide, you see the median. So the median is the point at which half of the people are greater than and half are less than. So this gives you actually a more realistic picture of what the average American has. So it's a much lower number. For white people, there's around 200,000 is their net worth. For black families, it's about a tenth of that. It's maybe 25,000. And again, Hispanics and other races have a bit more than blacks, but nobody has as much as white families do. So next slide. So the other thing to realize about net worth and the concept of wealth is that housing counts most for most Americans' net worth. So the way that economists look at income levels in our country is they divide people up into quintiles. So, the bottom 20%, the next 20%, and so on, 1/5 of each of the population. So at the lower your income is, the more your housing counts for your wealth, for your net worth. So at the bottom, the lowest quintile, housing accounts for 92% of a household's wealth. So most of their money is tied up in their home. For the second lowest quintile, housing accounts for about 75% of assets. For the next two quintiles, it's between 50 and 65% of your assets. And then as you have more wealth, as you have more money, you have your wealth tied up in other things. So you might have investments and savings, and your home is only about 34% of your net worth. And then whether you own your home or rent is also a huge factor in how much wealth you have. The median homeowner has 40 times the wealth of a renter, about $250,000 versus a little over $6,000. So if you're a renter, there's no way for you to build equity in a home, and so it's you generally don't have much in the way of net worth. So next, please. So let's talk a little bit then about, now that we've kind of laid the groundwork for what economically we're talking about, let's look at, and hopefully I've convinced you that housing is extremely important in terms of people's net worth or their wealth. So let's look at how housing discrimination has manifested itself in our country for many decades. So we'll start with the post-Civil War era, the Reconstruction era, because, of course, black folks not only didn't own housing or any other kind of wealth, they were in fact themselves owned and were considered part of somebody else's wealth. So we really can't talk about housing discrimination after the Civil War. And there was a Civil Rights Act of 1875 that was passed as part of Reconstruction, and it did a lot of great things, actually. It affirmed the equality of all men before the law, that it was men, so we could have a discussion about some other discrimination, but we'll save that for another time. But theoretically, all men were equal before the law. It prohibited racial discrimination in public places and facilities, so transportation, restaurants, people should have been able to move about freely regardless of their race. And it made it a crime to deny accommodations or services on the basis of color, race, or previous condition of servitude, was the way it was phrased. So did a lot of really great things, laid a wonderful groundwork for treating black people fairly after the Civil War. But what happened, unfortunately, was there were folks who who filed suits, and the Supreme Court at the time, in 1883, heard a number of different civil rights cases, and they totally turned things on its head. Basically the ruling was that neither the 13th nor the 14th Amendments were infringed by uncodified racial discrimination. So as long as it wasn't codified in law somewhere, racial discrimination was pretty much fair game. And if you remember, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment did all kinds of things, like it granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former enslaved persons. It repealed the 3/5 rule, which stated that slaves made up 3/5 of a person for states with regard to the Electoral College. It prohibited those who had been in rebellion against the Constitution from holding public office. So it actually set up a system in which the white people who seceded from the Union and fought in the Civil War, they were the ones who were not supposed to hold office because they had been insurrectionists. But basically this Supreme Court, these cases, threw that out, and the upshot was that discrimination cannot be constitutionally prohibited, and that opened the floodgates for Jim Crow laws all over the country. It was an 8-1 ruling, and the precedent that it established really stayed in place until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, so for 80 years in our country. So if that wasn't enough, there also came to be, particularly with regard to housing and land ownership, this idea of building into deeds associated with individual properties racially restrictive covenants. This came about because in the late 1880s, the Great Migration, it was called, of black people from the former slave states spurred white concerns about property. The whites were really, afraid that they would lose their property, so they tried to do everything that they could to make it so that black people could not buy housing and land. And so first, some municipalities passed zoning ordinances that excluded blacks from buying or occupying property in certain neighborhoods. But that was declared unconstitutional in a Supreme Court case in 1917 called Buchanan versus Wade. So that became a non-starter. But there are other ways, as my mother used to say, there's more than one way to skin a cat, right? So if you really want to discriminate against people, you can come up with other ways. So private arrangements were not prohibited. And this meant that these racially restrictive covenants, which basically prevented individual properties from being owned or occupied by blacks, started cropping up. And they actually started in Massachusetts and California. And then they spread to other parts of the country. And by 1940, 80% of properties in Chicago and Los Angeles carried racially restrictive covenants. So this was a very effective way of discriminating. So now you've probably all also heard of redlining. So what redlining was, that was attached to the Federal Housing Authority. And the FHA underwrote mortgages for banks. And so this is all private, kind of private stuff. The FHA, of course, is a federal government entity, but in terms of the underwriting process, that got around the prohibitions because it wasn't, legal means. So the underwriting manual first of all, it favored new construction on the edges of metropolitan areas over modernizing downtown properties. So it was a very intentional emphasis on growing the suburbs to the detriment of older properties in cities. And the FHA recommended explicitly redlining or marking as unacceptable investment areas neighborhoods where black people lived. So this practice continued from about 1934 all the way to 1968. But the FHA also recognized that redlining, there may be loopholes in redlining, so they also encouraged banks to ensure that there were racially restrictive covenants as part of the deeds. So they wanted to make sure that it was airtight, that black people did not get to buy property. So I want to show you a clip from a documentary that was done by a California group. And this is just a couple of minutes about the FHA and redlining.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even one or two non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized a national appraisal system where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating, and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
The racial logic adopts the principle that an integrated neighborhood is a bad risk, is a financial risk, that an integrated neighborhood is likely to be an unstable neighborhood, unstable socially, but therefore also unstable economically.
When the white residents of 8 Mile Road in Detroit were told they were too close to a black neighborhood to qualify for a positive FHA rating, they built this 6-foot wall between themselves and their black neighbors. Once the wall went up, mortgages on the white properties were approved. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government underwrote $120 billion in new housing. Less than 2% went to non-whites.
I can understand an individual, depending on his environment or his family or whatever, being racist, but for your country to sanction it, give him tools to do that, there's something definitely wrong there.
Yeah, so that's quite a powerful statement, isn't it? So I'll keep going through. We'll have some time to have some processing. I know this is a lot, and it's some of it is quite emotional, so I'll pause, but let me get through just a little bit more of the history. So I wanted to mention farmland also as distinct from housing. I'm not saying very much about it in this presentation, but definitely discrimination in this realm as well. You probably all heard the phrase 40 acres and a mule, and that came from actually at the end of the Civil War, when William Tecumseh Sherman was carving out this 5-mile swath through Georgia, 5 mile wide, all through the state of Georgia, and burning homes and property as he went. He got all the way to the coast, to Savannah, and which is actually where I'm from, by the way. And the founding fathers got together and they met him outside the city, and they said, please don't burn Savannah. We'll just surrender, and we'll give you a house to stay in. We'll give you places to have your headquarters, just please don't burn it. So he agreed, and he actually sent a telegram to President Lincoln, because it was just a couple of days before Christmas, and he said, President Lincoln, your Christmas present is the city of Savannah. And so then, as Sherman settled in for a little while, he decided that he wanted to actually talk to black leaders and ask them what they would like to see changed as a result of the war, because it looked like the Union was going to win the war at this point. So he met with 20 black ministers in Savannah, and they overwhelmingly said to him, well, we need land. We need to be able to farm our own land. We need property. And so from that conversation, his idea was for the Union to seize land from right along the coast, from Charleston down through Savannah, and then down to what would now be the city of Jacksonville, Florida, and to give that in 40-acre parcels to former slaves. And he also had an excess of mules in his division, so he was going to throw in a mule. And he proposed this to President Lincoln, and this began to be, a serious proposition, this kind of plan. And the Freedmen's Bureau was actually established by Congress in 1865 to follow up on this kind of idea and to redistribute land and either give it or sell it at very low prices to recently freed former slaves. So this was the original intention. But when President Lincoln was assassinated and President Johnson took over, he completely, disagreed and reversed the decision by executive orders and reneged even on sales that had already been made to former slaves. So when blacks were not able to buy their own farmland, they were forced into the practice of sharecropping, where the landowner allowed the tenant to farm the land in exchange for a portion of the crop. But this is, obviously much less beneficial than actually owning your own land. And it also tied these folks to a particular parcel of land. They never could get enough money. They might be able to subsist, but they could never build wealth enough that they could have any mobility or to do other things. So, so the number of farms owned by black people has always been low, and it's only gotten lower. In 1910, they owned 14% of farms, but 100 years later, by 2012, they only own 1.2% of farms. So discrimination has certainly happened on farmland as well as housing. But you've probably also all heard that one big boon to white people that didn't get shared with black people was the GI Bill. And the official name of that legislation was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. And it had far-reaching impact. The main components, because some of them, they started in 1944, but many of them continued for years after. So there was unemployment compensation that went for 5 years after the war for veterans. There was the payment of tuition and expenses for college or trade school that continued until 1956. There were low-interest mortgages made available up until 1962, so almost 20 years. And then there was the creation of hospitals and the whole kind of VA healthcare system, which of course continues today, although and we all know it's had a lot of problems and hasn't worked well for a little while. But if we go on, so we'll see, just to get a sense of the scale of this and who benefited. There were 16.1 million Americans who served in the military in World War II, or 11% of the population. And of those, 1.2 million were black men. And about 200,000 were women who served in the military. Now, women served in many other ways. 6 million worked in wartime factories, and 3 million volunteered for the Red Cross. Of course, but these benefits were not extended to them, of course. And then 14.7 million white men were really able to take advantage of, these benefits. Now, it didn't explicitly say, the GI Bill did not say that, black people were not eligible, but what happened in practice was, the benefit of tuition at schools. There were very few schools that would take black people. So, they went to historically black colleges and universities, or they weren't accepted in other places. And they couldn't buy, and we've already seen that they weren't allowed to buy property, so they couldn't really take advantage of, mortgages. So it was discrimination in fact, even though it wasn't necessarily written into the law. So, so let's take a listen to another short clip.
As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, the housing market open to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
Where one's family lives in America is not just a matter of taste and preference. You have the issue of housing and wealth. The majority of Americans hold most of their wealth in the form of home equity. So that's their nest egg. That's how they can finance the education of their offspring. That's how they can sort of save up for retirement. It's their savings bank, right? They're living in their savings bank.
My family, like a lot of families, was in Detroit struggling to buy a house. You had a dual housing market, one white, one black. A housing market with one with a lot of demand, another housing market with very little demand. My father lives in the house that I grew up in. The house today, 5-bedroom house, is worth about $20,000. That same house bought in the suburbs would be worth today about $320,000. So whites moving to the suburb were being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth, while blacks were being divested.
And these were public policy decisions in which, on one hand, people were given access to property, given title, and subsequently wealth, and on another hand, where people were not given access to property, did not generate wealth, and did not generate the kind of opportunity for their next generation.
So if you can get a government loan and with your GI Bill, your newly earned college degree, and buy a house in an all-white area that then appreciates in value, that then you can pass on to your children, then you're passing on wealth that has all been made more available to you as a consequence of racist policies and practices. To the child of that parent, it looks like my father worked hard, bought a house, passed his wealth on to me, made it possible for me to go to school, mortgaged that house so I could have, relatively debt-free college experience and finance my college education. How come your father didn't do that? Well, there's some good reasons why maybe your father had a harder time doing it if you're African American or Latino or Native American.
And the thing that's really slick about whiteness, if you will, is that most of the benefits can be obtained without ever doing anything personally. For whites, they're getting the spoils of a racist system, even if they're not personally racist.
So, so just to bring you up to kind of now, and then we'll take a minute and try to process some of this. But the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008 also had a racial component. According to a report by the Social Science Research Council that was done for the ACLU, quote, deeply rooted economic inequality fueled some of the most harmful lending practices, allowing financial institutions to engage in discriminatory and predatory lending that accelerated the financial collapse. Looking back, it is clear that racial discrimination played a pivotal role in the housing market crash. And then it also played a role in the recovery. So during the recovery from 2009 to 2011, the typical white family's losses did slow to zero. There was a true recovery for most white families. But the typical black family lost an additional 13% of their net worth. And the assessment is that this will last into the future. By 2031, white wealth is forecast to be 31% below what it would have been had we not had the Great Recession, while black wealth will be down almost 40%, meaning that median wealth for a typical black family in 2031 will be almost $98,000 lower than it would have been without the Great Recession. So, so let's take a minute. I've thrown a lot of stuff at you, and some of it is kind of heavy, and I may have stirred up not only thoughts, brain thoughts, but things in your heart as well, some of your feelings. So if you could just take a few minutes, find another person near you, talk a little bit about what you think of what you've heard, how, if you knew them before, and how it's making you feel. We'll do that for, let's see, just probably about five minutes, actually. Okay. So maybe just take one more minute to wrap up. Okay, maybe if we could come back together. Wrap up your conversations. So, would anybody be willing to share anything with the larger group that they were thinking or feeling? Yes, Bill.
I just wanted to add that I think I learned some while ago that when they were putting the GI Bill together, that the Southern senators required that agricultural workers be excluded from the GI benefit. If they'd gone from agricultural worker into the Army, came out of the Army back into agricultural workers, they were excluded from the basic benefits that the GI Bill offered. And it was one of those Southern compromises that, you know, in those days, the Southern senators were Democrats. That's what they recall.
Right.
And that process of accommodating that Southern senator group meant that all throughout the New Deal, everything that was passed they had to be compromised with, because otherwise they wouldn't have got done. So even public housing and everything was built into it, was this discriminatory, racist system, you know, built into the actual framework of the, you know, of everything that was passed.
Yeah, yes. Not surprising, unfortunately. Sad, but not surprising. Thank you. Anybody have anything they'd like to share? Yeah.
Well, one of the next steps, my thought process was the topic of reparations, which we didn't get any one simple answer to, but the thought came to our minds.
Right, yeah. Well, yeah, and you can see why, right? When you hear all of this, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we won't go quite that far today, but yeah, it's definitely worth having the conversation. Yeah. Anybody else? I know for me, I don't have all the folks' names in the video because I took them from different portions, but one of the black man, John A. Powell is his name. He said that whiteness was pretty slick because you can benefit from being white without ever doing anything really overtly racist, right? And I know for me personally that I always have tried not to. I don't use horrible language to people, and I don't treat people badly. I think and. But I started realizing, oh my goodness, when I think about, my father, my grandfather, and and the woman also who talks about, you can be from a family where your dad worked hard and saved money when it sent you to college, and why can't other people do that? Well, I mean, my grandfather and my father worked really hard, and they sent me to a good college, and I had and I never thought about it, but now. I'm realizing, how many advantages I had that I didn't even realize before, right? Yeah. Okay, well, yes, yeah.
I was just going to say, I find that one of the most challenging forms of resistance is white folks who feel like they worked hard.
Yes, right.
So white folks who feel like they worked really hard, especially if they are in a situation to bring themselves out of poverty, right? So they worked extra hard, so they feel so deeply proud of how hard they worked to achieve, and that somehow by saying, but look, there were things that contributed to your ability to have that opportunity, somehow threatens their worth or their accomplishment in a way that makes it very hard for them to think about an alternate model or that both could be true. You know, that there could be this built-in systemic racism that but I also worked hard. You know,
Yeah.
It's one of the hardest forms of resistance I find to talk about.
Yes, yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, that both could be true.
But I think that is a generational type of phenomenon because I think it's harder and harder to work your way out of poverty now.
Yeah.
And so I think because we're coming to this leveling that we've never experienced before as a country, I think people will be forced to really sort of look at a complex history.
Yeah, yes. Thank you. Yes, Donna.
Two comments about working hard. People making money off of their investments aren't working at all. They're just sitting there making money off of their investments. So that doesn't wash with me. But the other thing is, most of my career, all of my career, I worked with poverty-stricken people. And I saw people, you know, working 3 jobs. And they couldn't work their way out of poverty. And I'm thinking, how much harder do you want these people to work?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, they're falling down on their face now from exhaustion. How much harder do you want them to work?
Absolutely.
It's not possible.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah.
I also think something that people don't think about in this country either is that the housing size. Like, I feel like when we're really talking about equality, we're talking about so many different things that contribute, and I think Americans are really going to also have to think about how we've been living culturally and what that means if we really want to advance towards equality. So, and I think that's going to be a really challenging aspect for a lot of people with second homes, large homes. And I think that piece also has to be included in the conversation because it's a reality. And in other countries where there's more housing equality, I think, you know, there isn't the same, they don't have access to the same amount of and size of wealth that we do. So it's really, there's so many systems that need to be sort of moving towards this place.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, good point. Very good points. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for those comments. So let's continue on. If we could, Max. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so let's look at Vermont now, and the Vermont Housing Finance Agency has stated publicly that we did not have redlining in Vermont the way that, well, at all. I mean, really negligibly, I guess, not at all. The way that it existed in other places. So we can be pleased about that. But we did have other forms of discrimination. So Max, yeah, thank you. So we did definitely have the use of racial covenants, though, and you may have heard some of this in the news. There's been local coverage. I have a clip there from 7 Days. And then there was even national coverage because you may remember back when he was still alive, and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, William Rehnquist, bought a house in Greensboro, Vermont, and it had a racially restrictive covenant attached to it, so that became national news. But there are quite a lot of properties still in Vermont that have, have a clause in the deed that says they can't be sold to black people. And there has been some talk in the legislature about like kind of doing a blanket bill that would, declare all that null and void, but that hasn't happened yet. So there was certainly, discrimination here in Vermont. And then if you think about our housing situation, It's bad. It's bad. It's bad for a lot of people, right? This is an issue that Vermont Interfaith Action has worked on for a very long time because our housing is very unaffordable for large numbers of Vermonters. So there's a lot of different data you can look at. I try to pick just a little bit that I think is particularly glaring. So the idea of affordable housing is that a household spends no more than 30% of their income on either mortgage or rent and utilities. So what happens in Vermont, though, is that the red pieces are people who are spending over 50% of their income on their housing, and the yellow pieces are people who are spending between 30% and 49%. So taken all together, each vertical bar is people who are cost burdened by their housing, so they really can't afford their housing. So across all groups, it's around 34%. For homeowners, it's true for 27%. And for renters, it's even worse. 51% of people who rent really can't afford, their housing costs too much. And sometimes people say, oh, well, that's only true in Chittenden County, or Chittenden County is different, but you see Chittenden County and the state as a whole are just about exactly the same. So the state as a whole has a real problem with affordability with regard to our housing. And then if you look at it by race, you see differences. So white folks on the far left there, the percentage of people who own their own home is 72% of whites, and 28% of whites are renters. And then for black people, it's like flipped, exactly the opposite almost. 24% of blacks own their own homes, and 76% rent. So we already said right early on that if you're greatly disadvantaged if you only rent. You cannot build equity. You cannot build wealth if you don't own a home and you only rent. And then you see the different other racial groups. Nobody has it as good as white families do, but our black families have it the worst. So other Vermont statistics, just to talk about the differences. Non-whites make up 18% of Burlington's population, but they own only 4% of the city's houses. So it's right here where we are. Black Burlingtonians are 4 times more likely to be denied a home loan as their white counterparts. Median household income for a black Vermonter is a little over $41,000, while for a white Vermonter it's $58,000. And the poverty rate for black Vermonters is nearly 24%. For white Vermonters, it's 11%. So using lots of different data and statistics, you see that black folks in Vermont are definitely disadvantaged. So you've already brought this up, but I wanted to share some data about how do we help people get out of this? How can different financial practices that households engage in, can it help them counter the wealth gap? And different people, particularly white people, will say oh yeah, there are things that that people can do. So let's take a look at this. So one answer some people tout is, well, if black families attended if black kids attended college more, they would be able to get out of this severe income inequality. But you see that even white folks who have less than a high school degree have greater wealth than black people with some college. The far left is $18,800 for whites with high school, and skip over to the black with at least some college, and their wealth is still only $11,000. And white people who have been to college have astronomically more, $79,000. So it's very hard to make up any ground just by going to college. Sometimes people will say, well, the problem with black families is they split up and they're not two-parent households. There are too many single-parent families. Well, that doesn't make a big difference either. White people who have two-parent households with children, $161,000 in their median wealth, which is 10 times what it is for black people at 16,000. But even when you get over to single parents, white people still have 35,000 in wealth versus 5,200 for black families who have single parent households. So that argument doesn't really hold water. Some people will say, well, if they just had full-time work, they'd be able to work themselves out, as Donna was saying, out of poverty. That doesn't seem to be the case either. White people who have full-time work are at $82,000 worth of median wealth, whereas black people only around 10,000. And then even when you compare whites and blacks with part-time work, white people still have 4 times the amount of wealth than black people who work part-time. So lastly, well, they should just spend less. They spend too much, right? White people will say about black people, well, that just is not true either. Average household spending for white families is around $14,000, and for black families, it's about $8,500. So these things that you hear in society, there's a lot of data that falsifies them. So what will do some good? That's what the Vermont Interfaith Action Groups are trying to find. What can we do, particularly focusing here in Vermont, that will actually make a difference in this wealth gap and help to bring about greater equity. So there are 3 bills altogether. So these first 2 bills, our model is to do research on possible solutions. So we've met with the legislators who've proposed these, and with a lot of black-led groups and folks across the state. So these, we think, have the possibility of actually making a real dent in inequality in Vermont. So the first one, H232, would add 2 non-white members to the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, and that board is the one that takes a lot of the federal funds that come into the state and disperses them, decides what developments get funded and which ones don't. They make a lot of really crucial housing decisions in the state. So this would require that there be representation from non-whites on the board, and would also make expanding access to land and home ownership principle of determining the allocation of funds. So it would elevate the discussion to really try to be intentional about making sure that more people of color have access to funds. So that's one bill that we're looking at. And then H273 creates the Vermont Land Access and Opportunity Fund and establishes a 15-member board to make decisions about administering the funds. And this fund could be used for lots of different possible solutions. It would make grants to BIPOC persons to purchase homes and farms, grants for education and land stewardship programs, would want to provide incentives to towns to hold lands in trust for BIPOC people, would give them financial incentives to do that, would give money for mutual aid networks among people of color. It has a lot of different ideas in it. So these are 2. The first one, H232, it was introduced by a young woman who's serving her first term, Catherine Sims. She's from the Northeast Kingdom, actually. And then H273 was introduced by Representative Brian Chena, who some of you may know. He represents the Old North End here in Burlington. So these are a couple pieces of legislation that we think could provide some help. And then there's one more that focuses less on housing and more on business, but we're also interested in that. This is H406, and it adds a fifth principle for future economic development through the Office of Economic Opportunity. Actually uses the term course correcting historic racial discrimination. So it's not exactly the term reparations, but at least it sort of begins to steer us in that direction. It creates a Department of Cultural Empowerment and Economic Advancement in the Commerce Agency. It locates community empowerment centers in 4 different geographic regions of Vermont, and it appropriates $10 million to give out grants in different areas. Increases state procurement contracts with BIPOC-owned businesses, which is kind of an interesting idea, and establishes apprenticeship programs for BIPOC Vermonters. So this one was actually, the elements of this were devised by the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance, and Mark Hughes. Vermont Interfaith Action has a good relationship with the Racial Justice Alliance. So this definitely came from people of color directly, and it's also was introduced by Representative Brian Chena here in Burlington. So, so these are 3 pieces of legislation that VIA would like to see kind of move along, and the way that you could be helpful, the way that would work is, at the next slide. So we're going to focus particularly when the legislature goes back in January, and so from January to mid-March, the House will need to pass whatever they're going to pass to then send over to the Senate. So you have that initial period in each chamber. So we have a meeting tomorrow with the chair of the House Committee on, it's a great name, General Housing and Military Affairs. That's the committee where all 3 of these bills have been assigned. And Tom Stevens of Waterbury is the chair. And so first we need to, the chairs have a lot of power, and they can decide whether bills are taken up and discussed or whether they are ignored, basically, once they're assigned to them. So, so we want to make sure that Representative Stevens takes up these bills and at least has testimony on them and some discussion about them. And then after that, once the committee starts meeting in January, then we would like to make sure that they get passed out of the committee. If they get an affirmative vote in the committee, that means the whole House will vote on them and go to the floor. So we could use your help at that stage, definitely trying to contact committee members. Some of our group has already met with Tiff Bloomley, who's from here in Burlington. She's on that committee. And then if any of you are from South Burlington, John Kalaki is on that committee. But then there are people from other parts of the state, and they're fair game if they're on the committee. Even if you're not in their district, you can write to them and ask them to pass out these bills. So we'll be organizing a campaign to have you do that if you're interested. And then if they do get passed out of the committee and they go to a full vote in the House, then we would really need your help in calling or emailing or maybe having coffee with your representative. Then all the representatives get the chance to vote on them. So we'd love it if you would help us to advance them and get them to vote in favor of them. And then if you got very excited by today's presentation and you want to be more a part of what we're doing, you can join our monthly group, because Bill and Ashley and Lucia and Donna are all part of our monthly groups, and we'd be happy to have new members. And actually, that's okay. We can skip that one, Max. Thanks. You can go back to the previous one. So, do you have questions? But again, lots of information. Do you have questions about the bills, or do you have The other thoughts you'd like to share?
What's LOM?
Oh, that's a local organizing ministry. So that's our organizing committee, basically the group that works on these things.
The chairman of that committee, Tom Stevens, and what's the feeling about this possibility of passing it out at the committee?
Yeah, so we'll find out tomorrow. We're meeting with him tomorrow, and that'll be definitely a question that we'll ask him. They did take, it was introduced, these bills were all introduced actually this past January, and he took some testimony on one of them, but the other two, no testimony. So we want to kind of push him about making a commitment to take them up. We're also going to meet with the Speaker of the House later in the month and find out how she feels about these bills, because that's another way, of course, to advance things is if leadership supports it. You know, she has a lot of influence. Any comments or anything? No. So I realized I should have gotten the names of all the people who are here if I'm going to get in touch with you. That's what happens when I preach the same day that I do this. I wonder if people would mind, does anybody here, could you pass around like a sheet of paper that if you want to be on our mailing, I mean, you don't have to be, but if you want to find out more as we're trying to, thank you so much, Hannah. You know, as we're continuing this campaign and you would be willing to get an email that says, please call your representative, they're going to have a vote on this, you know, in 2 days or whatever, then that would be great. So please don't go. Yes, I think she's going to get one, so please don't go yet. Yep. So. Yes.
The federal infrastructure bill that's to be signed, I guess, tomorrow, has money for housing, I understand.
Mm-hmm.
How will that impact Vermont? How do you get that and channel it into?
Yeah, that's really, I don't know that much, to be honest, about that bill.
That's going towards people who are delinquent on their mortgage or property taxes. And then presumably there will still be assistance for rent. And they think it will be extended through June 2022 and hopefully longer. But that's earmarked for specific housing challenges by COVID.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I mean, once things do pass at the federal level, then we do try to see, okay, so how is that going to affect Vermont? But we haven't quite gotten there yet. Yeah. Actually, Max, you could show that last slide. I can, while you're deciding whether or not to sign up. There are a few things at the national level that could be done that would help address the wealth gap. Reforming the primary lending market of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and the secondary Wall Street banks. I mean, when we had the Great Recession of 2008, not a whole lot was done. I mean, some things are kind of around the edges were done, but if we really had somebody who was brave, I mean, obviously these people at these lending institutions are very powerful because they are very wealthy people, and it just is one of those situations where our elected representatives may or may not really stand up to them. So it would be really good to have some kind of comprehensive overhaul of the system. And then, having more open access to credit. Lending institutions have reacted excessively to potential borrowers, especially those who are lower income and BIPOC. So I don't know if any of you have tried to, refinance your home since the Great Recession. I mean, you are just grilled like you're a criminal now, right? I mean, you have to produce so many documents and all this kind of stuff. So they really, I mean, in some ways they sort of overreacted, right? And then in other ways they haven't reacted enough. So there really is need for the right balance there, but it is hurting lower income people and BIPOC folks. And then, regulating mortgage servicing also, so that unequal exclusion from housing opportunity is not the result. So selling the mortgages off and not, I mean, when I was researching this, I listened to stories from, people of color who were talking about, they tried to, they knew that, they lost their job and they knew they were in a situation where they were going to need to make some accommodation for their mortgage payments. And they went to their lending institution. They tried to be proactive about it, and they still got into a horrible situation, and they weren't treated, with respect, and they still got so behind that they had to sell the house, or they foreclosed on the house. So, there's a lot that can be done in the lending industry. So yeah, thank you all for signing, and thank you. Sorry about that. So yes. Yeah.
Huge issue that I see here and nationwide is the inability to rent for those who are at, minimum wage, low wage. There's nothing.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. In Vermont, the housing wage, they call it, is like twice what the minimum wage is. So you can't even get like a 1-bedroom apartment on a minimum wage. Yeah.
So who's doing anything about that?
Yeah, I wish they would do more at the federal level. That was one of the things Biden talked about when he ran. I agree with you. Huge problem.
Well, didn't the governor extend the use of motels for 18 months?
Well,
For the homeless?
yeah, we've been working on that. Well, it's just up through December right now, actually. It's still just through December. We've been working on that. BIA has. Yeah. For homeless folks. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I think locally in the state, the biggest thing is to get more housing stock, bring more housing stock online. There are subsidies available for renting, but the wait lists are too long because there's not enough housing stock.
Yes. Yeah.
But also people can't qualify because of property taxes, and so they can't qualify for that principal interest taxes and insurance initial payment, even if they can file a homestead exemption, when they file their taxes. So that's another big issue, is that there's just, income is so low here for low income folks, and property taxes are so high that it's, unless you're purchasing through a housing trust, it's almost, and even some of those properties the property taxes are too much.
Yeah.
And I think that to create a stable middle class and have a stable economy, home ownership is going down in the state, and it's like 35.8% in Burlington.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That's the truth. Yeah.
I have a question. When I drive around here, South Burlington, Williston, whatever, I see massive apartment buildings going up. They're huge. They are quite fancy looking. Okay, I would like to know who is living in those, where they're coming from.
Yeah.
And they say, well, okay, 20% of these are supposed to be affordable. I don't know what affordable means, a certain amount of your,
Right.
gross income or whatever. But what's also happening to the places that these people are leaving? Are they houses that could be rehabbed? What's happening to them? I just don't understand what the huge building thing is right now. And are these going to be empty? Or will there be enough people that have the money to go into them?
Some of them, I think, are independent living, in Williston anyway. Yeah.
Independent living?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Some of them.
You mean people that are moving out of their houses and
Currently,
going
yeah.
there? Well.
So, so I work for Champlain Housing Trust. We were building a lot of those big buildings, and it's all, it's a variety of different income levels that can be in there. But yeah, we're building as fast as we can, but the demand is so enormous. We just purchased 3 hotels this year, or 5 hotels in the past 2 years, and just trying to quickly turn them into rental housing. But it's a struggle. We have huge wait lists, and the demand no way to build fast enough.
The way to build that fast.
Yeah.
But,
And-
so my point was, the people that are moving into them, are able to pay whatever rent it is.
Yeah, I mean, we have, we have, a lot of the units are, you can't pay more than 30%. Like, that's just what the statute of
Okay,
where the
and
financing comes from requires
So
that.
they will fill up with people who, and a lot of them will be people who are not able to pay the full board then.
Yes. So, it's really,
Thank
you really can't tell from the outside what the income is gonna be on the inside. They all look the same, right? I mean, they don't really look any different now for a, affordable housing project and a market rate. It's almost impossible to tell, just by driving
Is it
by.
mixed? I
What's
mean,
that?
Juniper House, is that?
Juniper House is senior, but the one next door to it at Laurentide is our property, and that is, it's got a mixture of income levels in it. A lot of it's subsidized.
Yeah, Champlain Housing Trust does great work, so, thank you very much. And VIA has been supporting, making sure that we do have more units of housing. That really is one of the biggest problems.
So you asked
So,
the downsizing that people are doing, some of those houses that they're leaving behind are probably gonna go to student housing because UVM has a student housing crisis, and those students are living in Airbnbs.
yeah, it's very complicated here. The housing situation is really, really complicated, but.
Is this accessory dwelling unit law, does that solve any of the problem?
I think it will make a dent. I mean, really, there are how many, new units will we create that way? I mean, I think it's one of the tools in the tool belt, toolkit that we need. So thank you all very much for coming in, for your attention, and really, really appreciate it.
I want to remind you that on the front lawn is the Black Lives Matter thing that's going on right now.
Oh, yes, that's right, yeah. Yep. Thank you. Oh, sure, of course, yeah.
Can I sign too?
Yeah.